Welcome to the Daily Mushroom Podcast. Today we have Alanna Kit on the podcast. She's a friend of mine who works for a medicinal mushroom research and development company out of Toronto. So Alanna and I talk about her experience in working with that company in this really cool new emerging sector, and we get into some of our own experiences in working with medicinal mushrooms as well. So I hope you enjoy it. All right, here we are. Alanna Kit, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for
Very
having
excited
me.
to hear about your journey and what you're currently doing in the psychedelic research and development space.
Yeah,
Very interesting stuff. So to kick us off, tell us about Alanna Kit as the human being.
the journey, the
The journey,
storytelling.
yeah, like where are you from? You're in Toronto right now, and I'm pretty sure you're from the island. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
No,
Okay, there we
no,
go.
I
Let's start with
wish.
that. Yeah.
I was actually out in Victoria doing my master's science, for about 2.5 years. And I'm originally from just outside of Toronto in the Niagara region, wine region. Yeah. So grew up in the country and then, yeah, did my master's and have been in like the health and wellness space kind of my whole life.
Yeah.
So everything kind of led me to psychedelics, from plant medicines and kind of my roots and upbringing. My mom and my grandparents having the Ukrainian roots, we all kind of grew up with a lot of plant medicines
Mm,
and foraging and farming and just like very hands-on domestic work. So it's like kind of the root and backbone of me, and
mm,
just like kind of built on that into the health and wellness space. So I did my background is in kinesiology and holistic health,
mm.
and so everything kind of led into psychedelics, and the pandemic has kind of been an initiator for that. So I
The
actually
great
have to thank it
accelerator.
for that.
Yeah.
The great accelerator. It's a great reset.
hmm Yeah, it's been
Yeah.
called a lot of things here. Um, so were your parents and grandparents with using any like psychedelic medicines, or was that like a natural progression from just your upbringing, like you spoke on there?
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainian indigenous roots, I would say, is like it kind of leads into like the mushroom foraging and the shamanism, I guess, as they
Hmm
would say. Um, I mean, I can't date back as far as to like Ukrainian shamans,
Yeah.
but mushrooms are a big factor, and foraging is it's a Ukrainian tradition. So I kind of grew up,
Very cool.
on our property, we would go out in the fall and pick wild mushrooms and try to identify them and then cook them up. And so that was, yeah, that was kind of my upbringing, and it's a big staple in like the Ukrainian cuisine. So I think, yeah, mushrooms
What's
run in my blood.
the favorite edible mushroom for the Ukrainians?
Ooh, um, there's, I don't know. They're all like wild. They're all very wild mushrooms, not really identifiable, but I can't really say the English form. I only know them in the Ukrainian names,
Give me the
which are a
Ukrainian name.
little different.
I believe I'm like 1/8 Ukrainian. I'm not
Really?
100% on that. Yeah, I think
Well,
my
when we
mom
fry
used
them
to.
up, they're called like pipenke, and that's kind of like we make like mushroom dumplings and put them in our borscht,
I love
which is really
dumplings.
yummy.
The best
Yeah,
things. Shout out
yeah.
to Dumpling Drop out here, the
Oh
local
my gosh,
company.
so
If you
good.
haven't, yeah, you
I've
have had
had
it.
them. It's
Awesome.
so good.
Yeah, they are really doing some amazing things there. Just with how easy they are to like take home and prepare yourself too.
Totally. When you get them
Without having.
frozen and you just
Yeah.
fry them
Oh,
up.
yeah. So good.
I've been wanting to
Delicious.
do like a pierogi truck
Ooh.
stand
Yeah. Yeah.
one day.
I'm
One day I
all
think I want
for
to do
that.
that.
Let me know how I can help.
Yeah. Add some
Pierogies are
mushrooms
one of
into the
those.
mix.
Yeah, oh, so good. Yeah, that's like my go-to comfort food. If I'm ever feeling a little bit cozy or down, just grab a bunch of pierogies and
Pierogies.
have a pierogi party.
So comforting. Pierogi party.
Yeah,
That sounds nice.
Yeah, it's a good party. Everyone's invited.
Yeah.
So, okay, so kind of the natural progression you're going through, kinesiology, uh, your family, foragers, and then the transition from, just regular mushrooms into psychedelic mushrooms. And how did that come
Yeah.
about? Like, tell me kind of that story of who did you meet? Who like got you onto it? Were you familiar with like had you done some like tripping on your own and experienced the medicine?
Yeah. So I did experience it and experiment with it. Not like at a very young age, like quite recently actually.
Mm,
I think the crossover for me was being in the yoga and meditation and breathwork realm,
right.
and kind of going more into like spirituality and exploring in that realm brought me to psychedelics.
Mm,
So I found such similarities to like when I was tripping my brain when I was meditating or in like a deep trance meditation. I found it so similar.
mm,
And um, my thesis was more around like neurophysiology and biomechanics. And so I was most curious about like how the brain was on psychedelics and the neuroplasticity that occurs, the brain, the patterns, the repatterning of the default mode network.
yep.
So that is kind of what really sparked my curiosity of it, and some personal stories around like environmental induced mental health and overcoming it. I was kind of in a place right when the pandemic hit where
Mm,
I finished school. I moved back from BC. I just got out of a relationship. Everything kind of initiated this like transformative path for me where
mm,
I literally had a blank canvas
right.
and had to see it as an opportunity. And they say like crisis is your greatest opportunity. And I
Absolutely.
actually like found found ways in which to manifest what I wanted
Mm,
and find my own identity and sort of
hmm.
pave my own path. And so that crisis became the biggest gift,
Right.
and has been like unfolding since then.
Yeah. Amazing.
So yeah, that's kind of been a journey. And once I also saw like a personal friend of mine undergo like a flood dose therapy
Hmm.
and saw the effects of it, and I was like,
A
okay,
flood
this
dose?
is well, that's I guess that's the pharmaceutical term that people use now for macro dosing.
Okay.
It's like a
Cool.
flood dose, so they just flood the
Ah,
brain, and
got it. What's
um,
considered to be a flood dose? Like how many like milligrams or grams of psilocybin?
depends on the body weight ratio
Mm,
to it. So it could be anything between I don't know 2 to 5 grams, 2 to 6
gotcha.
grams. It depends on the body weight.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so after my friend's macro dose and seeing the changes pre and post, I was like, okay, this is a new industry that I have to get involved with.
Yeah.
And so I made it my mission to just get in there and
Wow.
manifest and work and connect with as many people as I could and learn from people within the industry. So that, yeah, that kind of initiated it. And now I work for a psilocybin based pharmaceutical startup.
Hmm.
So we're looking at drug development and yeah, just the whole landscape fascinates me because there's so much pivoting that occurs at all times.
Hmm.
We
Yeah.
really
Operating in a
don't
very
know
gray area, right?
totally. And,
Yeah.
looking at different countries and the legality behind it, the proprietary IP development, the regulatory, dealing with the government,
Hmm.
competitors. So there's a bit of a interesting race to IP and clinical
Yep.
trials going on. And then also looking at the balance between psychedelics as medicines, plant
Hmm.
medicines, and
Yep.
honoring the indigenous roots from that.
Right.
It's something very dear to my heart, and you know going from plant medicines to big pharma, there's going to
Hmm.
be this really interesting
Power struggle.
evolution and
Yeah,
power struggle, and giving credit where credit is needed.
right.
Um,
Because it seems
and
almost
yeah,
counterintuitive to, like develop certain strains or certain drugs that can be intellectual property, right? In the space of where, and what I would love to hear from you from kind of being on the inside and working with a research and development company, is it fairly collaborative? Is it kind of cards close to your chest? How are these different companies kind of communicating with each other?
they're not. It's very competitive.
Yeah,
Cards are very close
big
to the
money involved.
chest. Yeah. Capital is, I find the market really, really interesting, and
Mm,
how that's going to go, because it's the Wild West right now.
absolutely.
It's kind of I guess, the new cannabis, people are saying, although
Yeah,
there
for sure.
is there is
Some parallels
differences
there.
in that it's not going to be recreationalized, at least
Hmm.
in Canada.
Yep.
That's all I can speak for. But there's going to be more control over it, as it should, because it is a medicine and shouldn't be abused, because
Yeah.
the potential of it is incredible, and we have
Yeah.
one chance to do it right.
No
um,
kidding.
and it and I really believe that it can solve the mental health crisis, and even bring us closer to connection to nature, and start to
Absolutely.
bring about more sustainable behavioral changes.
Hmm.
So
I
bringing
couldn't
in more
agree with you more there.
interconnectedness.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I think like one of the best phrases that I've started to hear more and more over and over is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Because up until probably the last few months, a lot of people talking about like psychedelic therapy, and I've done some psychedelic therapy on my own. And by on my own, I mean literally just in my bedroom, taking 5 grams of mushrooms, and just seeing what would happen. Putting a blindfold on, listening to some music, and just kind of going through my own journey. And I think what I got out of that is that the psychotherapy side, right? So like the psychedelic assisted, it's like the psychedelics can be enough. You can have some pretty powerful experiences, but then sitting with a therapist and doing that integration, that like post integration, and then you're set, like preparing for it, is where I
Mhm.
feel like the real power lies from that therapeutic side. So that's been a
Yeah,
big thing that I've been really thinking about lately.
yeah, and it's so multifactorial. And one of the reasons, like, I never wanted to go into pharmaceuticals, because I'm more holistic,
Mm,
um, in the way that I look at health.
right.
I think it has a place, the right time and place and whatnot. But
Hmm.
what I really liked about the pharmaceutical industry, or the psychedelic industry, is how disruptive it is to
Yes.
pharmaceuticals, and the potential to bring about more of a holistic, integrative therapy, and connect so many dots,
Right.
and fill so many gaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and it's once the drugs are developed, once we go through these clinical trials, and you can go so many different ways.
Hmm.
The type of drug, whether it's synthetic, whether it's naturally derived, how it's extracted, how it's purified, the
Mm.
whole um, the whole process in the lab can differentiate, and that's what's sort of mapping out the IP strategies
Right.
within some of these companies.
Yep.
However, that's great. We have a drug. So now
Hmm.
what? Like,
Right.
it's amazing, because most SSRIs are just as good as a placebo, I
Right.
found.
Hmm.
Um, However, now what? It's almost more important to focus then on the integration aspect of it,
Absolutely.
and that's when the real magic can happen with this therapy, and change the whole mental health industry.
Yeah.
So there's
And
so
just
much room for that.
changed like society as a whole. That's a long game vision, right? But
Mm-hmm.
you think about traumas that people are experiencing in their early years, and then like living those out and replaying that through adulthood, which can lead to some pretty nasty habits and situations. And if we were working on this stuff from an earlier age, and let's say we just started to cipher out some of the money from the side of the healthcare system that's very reactive, right? It's just like taking care of all these problems, and we started to move that into the proactive side, where everyone, not just wealthy people, which is, maybe where this will start with a lot of psychedelic therapies. It's going to be expensive to go through it. I think I saw a couple treatments was like $2,000 for a ketamine therapy, and that's great to see that moving through. But even with just regular counseling assistance for people in Canada, it's expensive. Like if you don't have health benefits, it's hard to get mental health therapy, right? So when we see that start to move in and like become largely accessible, a lot of these like down the line health problems and the system being very reactive to people developing all sort of like stress related diseases, right? That's what I think. I'm very excited to see that shift in kind of how do we get ahead of these problems. And I believe that psychedelics are one of the things that we have a huge shot at really making a difference there. Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is just one of those, exciting industries where, like we can actually do something about this.
Yeah, there's definitely a space for it, and I think like it's a great initiator. I think there definitely still needs to be a lot more research that goes into it, which it's great to see like how much is coming out of the pipeline, how many research institutions are signing some of these startups on and opening up more psychedelic research centers. I'm curious to see how the long-term effects are with these psychedelics, because like we said, like integration being one of the most important aspects of this therapy is like how can we lengthen the effects of these therapies, because once it's initiated, I think there's a study that came out of Johns Hopkins that said that there's an average of between 6 to 18 months where there's this effect, and then your default mode network starts to repattern or go back to its original behaviors.
Right.
So how do we start to create those new ski slopes, as Michael Pollan talks about in the default mode network, right?
Yeah.
I love that analogy.
The snow falling down and covering the old tracks so that new tracks can be formed. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how do we form those new behavioral pathways? And that's what really gets me excited, is like, how can we implement behavioral changes for people and decondition their thought patterns? So after they have that flood dose, how can we change those behavioral patterns? And to me, I believe that it can be done in a very like holistic manner, through cognitive behavioral therapy, through clinical psychology, but also implementing mindfulness and yoga and all these different modalities that can lengthen the long-term effects of this therapy, so that they don't have to keep taking it over and over again.
Absolutely. And that's the difference in the education side and the integration side of using psychedelics versus traditional pharmaceuticals, is that traditional pharmaceuticals are always just that Band-Aid, right? It's like, take this and call me in the morning and come back and, in a month we'll refill your prescription and you just keep taking them. And you could ask, 10 out of 10 doctors, if you're on SSRIs, well, what else should I be doing? And, they might say, drink lots of water, get sleep. But where's the integrative, like habitual changes that are being recommended to us? Dietary changes, mindfulness, meditation. That is something where this space has a huge opportunity to bring that in and like really encourage people to integrate that into their daily lives. I find too, after I do a larger dose of psilocybin, I naturally want to meditate more as well. Like I feel more connected. I feel more grounded. I just want to take more time, more space. I want to spend more time in nature. So it's this kind of a natural push towards those practices as well, which is just an unbelievable, beautiful thing to experience. Yeah.
Well, I think because you're not afraid of your mind, and so many people try to escape their mind. And once
Yeah.
you undergo that flood dose and you make friends with your mind, all you want to
Hmm.
do is be in it. It's like
It seems
you
like a pretty
create a
fun
more,
place all of a sudden.
yeah,
Yeah.
you create this hospitable environment,
Hmm.
and you actually have like a natural affinity to to go into your mind and elicit that. And I found like since um I had a really, really great macro dose a couple months ago. And since then, I found that, transcendental meditation, deep meditation elicits a similar response.
Hmm.
So if we can implement that to people after they have this flood dose, then the results will continue. The effects will be longer. However, from a finance perspective and a scalability, like business
Yep.
perspective, that's not scalable,
Right.
right? So
Back to the money
that's what I'm
problem.
super curious about, is like how
Hmm.
these startups are going to make their businesses scalable. Will they focus on the drugs and the therapy? And, you know, I don't know.
I
Um,
think that I think the from the business side, kind of what we touched on earlier, is the opportunity for these businesses to, like, we talk about the integration, right? And it's not easy. Like, we're creatures of habit, right? Especially if you're someone into adulthood or like later adulthood, you've got some pretty hardened patterns that if you go into a flood dose, maybe for that first month or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, you're going to feel really good about keeping up and doing some meditation, mindfulness practices, changing your diet, living in, spending time in nature. And I think for businesses, it's going to be that people getting the mental health therapy that they need in a longer form, and that integrating into society, right? Again, then it becomes, how do we redirect a lot more of our money that's being pumped into the healthcare system to just having these services be available to people that are not expensive, that you don't need to even have like health benefits or anything, right? Like, you can just go maybe do a flood dose and then see a therapist every week that is trained in the medicine, that can work with you and keep you on track, towards just living a calmer, better life.
right.
So
The
that could
accessibility
be the
factor will be
business, right?
big. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So, and I'm also curious to see like where it goes from like a market access perspective. I think so many doctors and therapists are very intrigued on it. I
Hmm.
don't think it's like that well known yet, though. Like it hasn't really transpired too much.
Right.
Forget that I work in like a bubble,
No kidding. I know.
you know?
And I'm over
Like,
here on Vancouver Island, where it's just my own bubble over here.
yeah, yeah. And I think like, when I speak to doctors and nurses and therapists and stuff, it's still not, it's definitely not recognized. There's a curiosity for it. But I think like the timeline of it is we're still like 5 to 10 years out.
Absolutely. Totally.
And
It's a
it's
big
kind of going to be like
deconditioning movement,
yeah,
right?
I think
Like,
it's going to be really, really transformative and radical.
hmm.
But um, yeah, and it'll be interesting to see like which companies act first. So,
Right.
we're seeing like in the UK and Germany, like they've been doing this research for a while. Like
Hmm.
Compass and Atai, they started like over 5 years ago.
Right.
Um, so there is a really interesting race to clinical trials. Um, once patents become public, because it takes
Hmm.
18 months for a patent to become public and out there, it'll be interesting to see what companies perish, which companies get
Right.
acquired. Like
Hmm.
there's going to be a bit of shuffling, and it's similar to the
Absolutely.
cannabis industry. There's going to be like a big boom and then
Right.
a settling, right? So it's
Well, yeah, when
interesting.
legalization hit in what was it, October 2018? I know I was definitely holding the bag on some um, cannabis companies that didn't do so well. The
Right.
big crash, right?
Yeah.
And everything was overvalued, and a lot of money got
Yeah.
sucked out of the system, which again is unfortunate because that hurts a lot of the companies that were working. And then, once all the investors pull out because they were playing, the money game, a lot of these companies had to go under and therefore stop working on their different projects. So we will
Yeah.
see that again with this space.
Well,
But
supply and
again,
demand, right? And
totally.
also like the black market, how that will be managed.
Yeah, how will the
How the
people from the
government
black
will.
market integrate into the legal market when that starts to happen?
Yeah, and even from like a business perspective of pricing, a price point to do a
Right,
flood dose, macro dose, like
right,
what's to say that someone won't just do a dose on their own in their home or in a
right.
safe setting and then go to their therapist and talk about
Hmm.
it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah,
I don't know. I think there's
so
a lot of question marks. So the more resilient and the more, you know, flexible these companies are,
yeah,
the better.
right.
But I think there's definitely a space for it. I think there's a reason why so many people are wanting to get involved in this in the medical
Absolutely.
space. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, it takes just kind of going out there and facing the fear. And I talk about the deconditioning a lot growing up, thinking that psychedelics were going to like destroy my brain forever if I ever touched them, right? Like LSD, I'd go crazy and jump off a bridge, a lot of fear
Right.
tactics. And
Jump out
so,
the window, the classic one.
yeah, oh man, scary stuff, right? Like,
Mm,
lose your mind, never be the same. Like, you couldn't have certain jobs if you took LSD or if you took mushrooms. Like, I remember hearing those ones in early high school, talking to my guidance counselors. uh, and so there's that feeling and there's that stigma around psychedelics. And I
huge
felt it
stigma.
the first time I was doing it. I was like, oh, I don't know about this. Like, kind of just trusted my friends who handed me a few mushrooms and off we went and everything was fine. Nothing bad happened.
Right.
And what's amazing to see is these studies come out of just how safe ketamine, LSD, psilocybin is compared to alcohol, caffeine, all
Yeah.
the standardized drugs that we love to use to just like get us up in the morning and put us to bed at night, right? That are
Hmm.
just so socially normalized, but cause, if we're going to talk about problems in the healthcare system, how much money do we spend on alcoholism, right? And just what a really interesting thing that I experienced from my last, I'll call it a flood dose because I like that. I like your terminology there. Was that for about 5 weeks afterwards, the thought of drinking alcohol just didn't appeal to me at all. And I enjoy alcohol. Like I love. I used to drink a lot. I don't drink as much anymore. I like to have a couple beers on a nice day and a glass of wine with
Sure.
dinner. But even just like the small amount just seemed a little
Right.
bit. It was just there was that hesitation there
Moderate.
where I was like, oh, I don't really feel the need to put that on my body right now, which was an interesting experience just to see again that different way that your brain gets rewired after a dose like that changes, just shakes
Totally.
everything up, right? Your habits are kind of turned upside down, and then there's a chance to kind of, like you said earlier, rewrite how you want to live in your daily life. So
Yeah, you have the choice
that's
to
really cool.
start a new story, a new chapter.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, I mean, I love how psychedelics are also targeting, pain, inflammation, addictions,
Hmm.
and the efficacy around that. Because at the end of the day, addiction and mental health, it does stem from genetics and our entropy, as Dr. Robin Carhart Harris just spoke about in one of
Mm.
his recent studies. And entropy, from a thermodynamics perspective, is like disorder. So
Mm.
disorder in the brain, how much disorder is going on, and how some people are more genetically predisposed to addiction from past genetics. Like if your parents were alcoholics, you have a higher chance of being an
Hmm.
alcoholic or a smoker,
Yeah.
whatever the case may be. And so yeah, there's the genetic factor, but then there's also the environmental factor. So looking at both sides and seeing, how we can repattern our brain and look at the epigenetic effects
Right.
of psychedelics and how we can actually modulate that
Hmm.
from a genetic
Could you
perspective
explain
and see.
epigenetics?
Yes, it's epigenetics is the interaction with us and the environment. And so
Mm.
we're constantly turning on and off genes daily with our consumption, with our environment, with what we consume, our diet, our exercise, everything. And so it's our ability to change the genetics that we inherited,
Hmm.
you know? And so that's, I mean, I don't think there have been many studies at all on the epigenetic effects of psilocybin
Right.
or psychedelics that I know of. I'm trying to think of our reference library.
Yeah.
It's getting pretty big,
Yeah, I bet.
but I don't think, yeah, from a genetic perspective, that hasn't really been looked at too much. However, like people that are predisposed to mental health issues,
Hmm.
I find that really, really interesting, and their interactions and maybe their sensitivity to mental health issues from experiences, from conditioning, and how
Mm.
that kind of is interwoven. You know, intergenerational trauma as well, like not just trauma from this life, but past lives, and
Right.
like how that's passed on to genetics, and thus affects
Right.
our entropy in our brain. So yeah, it's very multifactorial, but and that's I think that's why in the healthcare system it hasn't been appropriately addressed.
Right.
And the stigma of psychedelics has definitely affected that and delayed that.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah.
know, and looking back on like the history of psychedelics, was our society ready for it at the
Mm.
time? Do we have the research? Do we have the technology to assess it when it came
Mm.
out in the 60s?
Hmm.
Don't know. You know,
Yeah. The first big
escaped
wave.
the labs. So, and beforehand, like it had been used around the world in indigenous communities as a spiritual
Right.
um, connector.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I, me personally, I don't want that aspect to be lost. But when you look at it from
Of
like a
course not.
science and medical perspective, might be.
Yeah.
Um,
Probably on. I mean, on a lot of us Westerners here, it's hard unless you've lived in one of those communities and been like immersed in that culture. It might be a little bit difficult to comprehend, but I believe that it still needs to be an important part of the education and the understanding of like the history and the roots of these medicines and psychedelics.
oh yeah,
That's absolutely important to really know. We're not over here in the West. We're definitely not just like pioneers. Like this is this is nothing. It's not new technology. It's been around and people have been using it for thousands
right,
and thousands of years, right? So
right. So when I
listen
see
to
like
those people.
companies, yeah,
Yeah. Like let's listen to more of those people. Let's talk to more of those people. Let's get that insight that it has been passed down generation to generation. Those stories and those experiences, instead of just kind of starting from scratch here and thinking that we can just tear apart the psilocybin, whatever you want to call it, the molecule or the drug itself, and re-engineer it and do this and do that with it. And yeah, like, let's really understand why we started using it in the first place and how we started using it in the first place.
yeah, and
Back
it
to the
all comes
roots.
down to like the storytelling of it and corporate responsibility and
Yeah.
even if you are manufacturing it in a lab and extracting it and purifying it or creating it synthetically, I still think that it's the same compound and is giving a similar effect. So
Right.
it's important to give credit where it's due.
Absolutely.
um, and so there's some interesting articles right now that are coming out around IP, and
Hmm.
you can't really patent a mushroom.
Yeah. Patenting
Right?
nature. Yeah.
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 So yeah, although so
Hey,
many pharmaceuticals have come from naturally derived sources, and
right. Right.
So
And I think, the money isn't important. Like, we can't ignore that the amount of money coming into this space is going to drive things forward. It's going to change things. Uh,
yeah,
we have to try our best not to lose our connection to the roots of why these medicines and where these medicines came from, why they were used in the first place. But without the big money coming in to lobby government to start to maybe reduce some of that fear, those fear campaigns that have been pumped into our minds for so many years and decondition everyone, psychedelics wouldn't really have a chance to get onto like a mass use scale, right? Where everyone has the options to use them and can feel safe about using them, right?
for
So
sure. For
it's
sure. The
yeah, like
safety.
kind of we started by the push and pull, right? Of psychedelic age old medicines and big pharma money, kind of like that, those two worlds merging in that power struggle. It's going to be very interesting to watch. I think it's
Mhm.
super cool that you're getting to see it and work on it on the inside, from an inside perspective. And I just like the way that your your evolution into this space came in from a very like good place of mushroom foraging, holistic healing, and we need a lot of people like yourself in that space that like bring that energy to understand that it's not just about who's going to win and who's going to get to be first and this IP, that IP, and all that. So
Yeah, thanks. I think it's like kind of a hybridized version because there's two sides to my brain. There's like more of
yeah,
the
you're an investor
creative,
as well. We were talking the
holistic,
other day
yeah,
about you know
totally. A
the
tie
tie
going
went
public.
public and we were chatting back and
So
forth. You guys
anticipated.
in? You guys in? Yeah,
Yeah, I'm refreshing. They're
yeah,
supposed to hit 1020.
exactly. So it's yeah,
For
it's good to have
sure.
that balance though, right?
Yeah, the balance between like holistic, indigenous roots and also the science. There's such a big place for science. Science drives. So
Mm,
does finance, and I've always been interested in rewiring capitalism and looking at
mm-hmm.
it, not ruling it out because we need currency, we need
Yeah,
finance to drive change and be
totally.
effective change agents.
Yeah,
But
and healthy competition, right? Between
right,
people who might have, their goal might be to scale a company and sell it for $500 million, and that's what's driving them. But if the actual result behind that is pushing forward something that is ultimately very, very good for society, then, that's something that I think we should regulate and embrace.
yeah, and like my boss always says, like at the end of the day, we want to do good for people. You have to play the game. You have
Right.
to play the capital game
Hmm.
to do good for people and get it to the masses,
Right.
right? So long as it comes from a good place in your heart and
Hmm.
that's at the forefront of every decision that you make,
Hmm.
then that's where it'll drive it, right? But you can't like there's not you can hug as many trees as you want, but it's not going to help the mental health epidemic,
Exactly. Exactly.
right?
Yeah. You gotta, it's going to cost money to get that message out there and make it accessible for people. I couldn't agree more. Um,
Right.
so could you tell us a little bit, just kind of like, what's your day to day like in working in the psychedelic R&D space? Like, what are you really,
Um,
what's your position? Are you allowed to talk about that?
I could touch upon it.
Okay.
I think my role has changed like weekly
Yeah.
because because
Yeah.
things are always
Like you said to me earlier,
literally
like
changing.
we're all just figuring it out as we go,
Yeah, and
right?
there's
Emerging
a
space.
constant pivot, but that's like the excitement of it. And before I got into psychedelics, I was um, really interested in sustainability and startups. And I did an internship with a venture capital firm in Toronto just to learn more about the space,
Mm,
um, and understand the whole process of startups. I think like it's such a sexy area, but I just like
yeah.
love innovation. I
Right.
love I love when things are disruptive
Mm.
and changing radically
Yeah,
society.
entrepreneurship's gotten very, very hot in the last, probably with the rise of social media, right?
Yeah,
Entrepreneurships are like rock stars now, right? Like it's there are
Yeah,
new
kind of.
celebrities, and startups are very exciting. They're
Yeah,
fun and they're scary and weird, and you don't really know what's going to happen, but it's a fun way to work and operate.
definitely a fun way to work. And I also, coming out of school for most of my life, I wanted to learn as much as I could, as quick as I could.
Hmm.
And for me, that meant being in a startup. But, when I was in my pandemic crisis, we'll call it that,
Yeah,
my quarter life crisis,
yeah, that's good.
um, I
Just
was like,
happened to be a pandemic going on during your quarter life
yeah,
crisis. Yeah, it's just timing.
super timely
Yeah.
and very, very serendipitous. That's the catchphrase of 2020 to 2021. Everything
Hmm.
that came into my life was pure serendipity, which I've loved. And I told myself, I made a promise to myself that whatever, like I don't want to rush into a corporate job. I
Hmm.
can't sit for too long, anyways. But
Yeah, I hear you.
I need the standing desk.
Yeah.
Um, but I told myself that I would go into something that I really, really believed would drive change, that I was
Mm.
passionate about, that I would learn quick from, and this is how I came across it. And every single day, I've learned a ton, and I have a really, really amazing team that I
Mm.
work with, and um, it's just good people. And I think that from a corporate culture perspective, culture is everything,
Mm.
because then that's where everything
Absolutely.
comes from internal to the external. And
Yes.
yeah, so my day to day changes a lot. I work on the finance side. I work on the um, drug development side with the research. Uh, did a bit of branding when we had our mushroom brand. Yeah, so to
You're
be
very
as
much
vague
living
as
like the,
possible,
yeah, you're living like the
but corporate and
entrepreneurial,
research development, yeah,
right? Yeah, but you're having to wear many different hats as
yeah,
the beast kind of like shape shifts as not
yes,
just startups do, but a startup in a emerging market, illegal space.
yeah.
Very, very crazy. What can you tell us about, from your knowledge, around the interesting dynamic of the legalities in what you guys are working on? Because I know, like,
Yeah,
for example, Numinous, they were the first company in Canada to get a legal license for growing and cultivating psilocybin mushrooms. Correct?
from a PR perspective, yes. Um,
Is that not the case?
I
Oh
can't I
shit.
can't disclose,
Okay. All
but
right. We
it's
got an insider here. This is good stuff.
from a Health Canada perspective, like that's a whole other thing that I'm really interested in, is like the exemptions, the whole
Right.
process with exemptions. And
Hmm.
most of the companies that are saying that they have Health Canada exemptions have an associate affiliation to a university. So
Yes.
they're able
Right.
to license and produce and research
Mm.
that substance in a university. I think there's only two institutions, Cygin and Hallucinex, that
Mm.
isn't affiliated with the university and is a licensed manufacturer.
Right.
So this is another really interesting space, is like supply and demand for clinical trials,
Right.
and finding the active pharmaceutical ingredients companies that will produce it
Hmm.
and manufacture it for clinical trials.
Right. And so now you're speaking on pharmaceutical companies that are already in the space with their own drugs that are willing to take that risk, or
They need to look for manufacturers
right.
to produce the active pharmaceutical ingredient, whether it being naturally derived
Hmm.
and extracted and purified, or synthesized in the lab. So
Gotcha.
like if they have like a Health Canada exemption, which a handful of them do, they also need to produce now a ton of psilocybin.
Hmm.
And the amount, and here's another thing with the drug development, is like the mushrooms are great. However, we need to extract the psilocybin from it, because there's a
Right.
whole bunch of compounds from there. And then
Hmm.
there's a slew of variability between potency. So we need to find like a level that is normalized
Right.
and the same and constant. So that's a whole other laboratory question of like how can we normalize it and how can we decrease the variability between
Right.
the compounds. So you can't just grind up a mushroom like we do in our kitchen.
Throw it in the blender with everything else.
You can't do that.
Yeah.
So that means we need a shit ton of yield
Right.
to extract it and purify
Right.
it to get it to that psilocybin. So the
So
supply
we
and
can really
demand.
know the dose that
Yeah,
you're giving to people.
right. And so that's what's going to drive the price of these therapies is the purification process and
Gotcha.
getting rid of those compounds that may affect the trip and the
Yeah.
safety and toxicity
So
and the escalated dose.
what are some of the compounds that could be potentially harmful for a therapeutic trip?
Um, Not that many, but
Yeah, they're
so
pretty big.
like if you read the investigator's brochure at Usona Institute, there's
Usona Institute.
a
Let me make a note
great
on that.
long, and it's a non-for-profit, and they believe in having accessibility for psilocybin for everybody.
Yeah.
And they have like a whole list of adverse effects. It's not for everybody. People that are bipolar, people that are schizophrenic, people that are predisposed to of schizophrenia and what's the word? I forget.
Like personality
There's a
disorder or
split personality disorder. There's a whole list. They can't. They shouldn't be consuming, right? Because they're
right.
predisposed to the adverse effects that
Yeah.
may arise, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
not for everybody. And so there needs to be sort of that list and screening process for it.
Right.
And so, yeah, you can look up the Stone Institute investigators brochure around that.
Sounds like a very,
So,
very fun rabbit hole to go down.
yeah.
Awesome.
So it's interesting. There's so many different areas. There's the therapeutic integration. There's the science. There's the whole drug development, biochemistry aspects, finance. So it's really interesting to be working in all the different areas and constantly changing. Like there's always neuroplasticity occurring in the office.
Yeah, no
New
kidding.
pathways.
Constant learning.
Yeah. So I've loved it so far. And
Amazing.
I'm
And how
really
long
excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, and so kind of beginning of the pandemic, you set this intention, and then you've been working with them for how long now?
About 8 or 9 months. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I was
I've been watching the space, and it's just been crazy how fast everything's moving.
yeah.
Not only just the timing, right? I think the first company to go public in Canada was Mindmed back in March of 2020. So like right as the pandemic hit, and then pandemic hits, a bunch of money gets pumped into the system, and off we go, right? So it was a very interesting catalyst, I think, to see all this new money be created as we did when the pandemic hit, and we didn't have a choice because we had to pause the world for a bit, and then that being a crazy catalyst for finance the stock market to go to these all-time highs, and now there just being so much money in the system for everyone to work on this and do this research. So I'm amazed by the speed of everything. It's kind of scary, and I can't even imagine being in it every day. You talk about neuroplasticity and learning. It's got to be a wild time in there. I'd love to be a fly on the wall of your office.
Well, Brent, it's been a trip. It's definitely been a trip, to say the least. But it's interesting how when the pandemic hit, nobody knew what was going to happen, and everybody expected the markets to just tank and us to go
They
into
did
this
for a bit.
huge, a bit. Like we were expecting a recession or even depression, right? And that didn't seem to happen.
Fire up those money
However,
printers and
Yeah.
got us out of it real quick.
yeah.
here we
But a
are.
lot of,
Right.
a lot of cannabis money did go into
That's
psychedelics
true.
now. So
Right.
there's a huge bridge between that. There's a lot of
Yeah.
people from the cannabis space going into the psychedelic
Right.
space.
That did very well there, and they know how to operate in that gray zone as well, right? Which is that's very good education, I think, to have of like we've been here before, And
Yeah.
I'm sure if you built a cannabis company, let's say through 2014, 2015 through to legalization, they've probably got some relationships with the government and or legal authorities and the federal government to just navigate that, right? So I would love to learn more about how those conversations are happening behind closed doors. I don't know if you have any insight on those. That might be a higher level. Maybe the CEOs we want to have in that, and the founders are having those conversations with, you know, getting Trudeau on the phone and having those little backroom talks.
Yeah, I think like there's a lot of the same legal counsel from cannabis now in psychedelics because they know the way
Yeah,
to
they've
drive
got the
the
connections.
government
They
to
know how to
have those
navigate it.
conversations, how to word it, everything. I'm not in the legal space, so
Right.
I
Yeah.
can't really
Maybe
say
one
much
day.
on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But I do find like the Health Canada exemptions and following that with veterans and end of life patients really fascinating.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to obtain, but if you do have like a good legal counsel, I think like there's more initiatives. There's more like Theracell is doing amazing
Yeah.
work
Yeah. I was
for
just going to
that,
talk
and
about
it's
them.
only driving our research more, and it's only
Absolutely.
like helping tell the story more of how efficacious these really can be in so many different target indications.
Yeah. Yeah. We've been watching Theracil closely here over the past year in Victoria, and seeing, yeah, these nurses really like shouting at the top of their lungs as much as they can via social media to be allowed to do the experiential portion of their therapy, because if they're going to be helping people with uh, end of life process, I guess, in using psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, they need to be able to understand what their patients are going to go through, right? And yeah, I know a few of them have actually got the exemption, which is great. We need a whole bunch more, and we need a lot more nurses to actually step up and go into that. I know a ton of people are excited and nervous, and they want to take the plunge into that world. But there's definitely no shortage of people that need help with terminal illness, and
Mm-hmm.
just kind of making peace with what's coming, right? So they can leave the world as gracefully as possible, and just sit with their families. And Mackenzie and I spoke about this a lot on our first podcast of both like losing a parent and just seeing, yeah, the fallout of your family members, right, and just how psychedelics can play a role in that. So I think that's just an amazing place to see legal psychedelics pushing into first.
Right.
I'm excited to see where that goes.
Same. And I can even touch upon that in like a personal experience of mine
Yeah.
with death and loss and like how psychedelics changed my fear of death, I think. Like I was never like super afraid of dying, but like once when I had my macro dose, I experienced the feeling of death,
Leaving. Yeah.
um, of being completely dead, and I was like, well, I could be dead right now, whatever, and kind
Yeah.
of making friends with it and being like, this
Right.
isn't so bad. Um,
Yeah.
like I was literally in a box at the bottom of the ocean and completely pitch black,
Wow.
and after that, I started being really interested in people's perceptions of death, and not even from a spiritual perspective, but like an out of body experience that people have. And so I find that really, really interesting. And there's definitely a space for that for end of life patients. whether they experience, like, everyone has a different experience and whatnot, but
Yeah.
whatever's top of mind
Hmm.
um, comes up in your trip, right?
Yeah.
So if they're
What do
afraid of
you
dying,
think? Yeah. What do you think that is? That because that's across most of the psychedelics from everybody that I've spoken with that have done heavier doses, therapeutic doses. There is this experience of death, and a lot of people call it like the ego death, right? What do you like from your experience? What did you? How could you maybe explain it to make sense in your own mind of what you experienced sitting at the bottom of the ocean there? Like, what was that? What happened there?
well, I think it was a mix of the like sensory deprivation and the music that I was listening to.
Mm.
So the person that was sitting in for me played like whale noises.
Okay.
And so it elicited this really interesting like rebirth and death. And, um, you know, you go into a trip like thinking of like your intentions,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And facing your fears, all this stuff. You go into different doors of perception.
Mm-hmm.
And um, it was so interesting because my hands were freezing cold. I stopped feeling sensation in my body,
Mm.
and it was just pitch black, and it was just the sound of like water at the bottom of the
Mm.
ocean, and it was just pitch black, and I noticed, this is probably where the ego death came in. I noticed me wanting to bring light into the situation.
Mm.
And I've always been, I'd like to say I've always been like a very positive, bubbly person,
Mm-hmm.
and almost afraid of negativity and not having that like weight and depth, and sort of sitting in this like positive superficiality. So it was a really
Right.
interesting experience for me to witness and feel that weight and that depth and not feel afraid of darkness, and
Mm.
actually appreciate it and make friends with it and see the
Right.
balance between the light and the dark. It was really interesting how the ego sort of wanted to light it up and fix the
Yep.
situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then at that moment, I was like, no, surrender,
Mm.
take the light away, and just sit in darkness. And it's not that bad. And then
Right.
after that, I was then moved into this beautiful, beautiful, like white, golden, pure blissful tunnel.
Hmm.
Getting
The
really
tunnel that
interesting,
everyone
like
talks about.
a white tunnel.
What?
Had to die to then
How is it all the
continue
same?
on.
It's amazing, right? Like, how do
Yeah.
we all experience something so similar? It's got to be something more than just our individual experiences. There's a connectedness going on there.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very cool, very inspiring.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And it's almost like that like end of life experience that people have going through the tunnel, that
Mm.
white tunnel, that out of body experience that we have where our senses are heightened,
Mm.
right? And there's a really interesting documentary that I watched called The Pyramid Code
Write
that
something
I'm
down
so
again.
obsessed with.
Okay.
The Pyramid Code, and it talks about the Egyptians and the purpose of pyramids. And
Mm.
I remember one of the professors talking about how, in our day and age we have five senses, but if we look back on their old scriptures, they talked about having 30, and the
Mm.
use of plant medicines and psychedelics, and how they they had heightened senses. They were way more interconnected
Mm.
with astrology, with nature, with one another. There was more synergy
Mm.
occurring, and that synergy is something that I really hope psychedelics will bring into our society more interconnection within ourselves, within others, within nature, and just have more overall interconnectedness.
Love it. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think we should, on the interconnectedness note, and speaking on death, let's cap it there. That's a beautiful way to end this conversation. Um, Thank you so much for joining us today and having
Thank
this
you.
this conversation. And you're going to be out here at the end of August, you said,
Yes,
so we can do another one
I'm
face to
coming.
face. We can talk
Yeah,
more. You'll have
yeah.
you'll have 2 more months of neuroplasticity from being in that R&D incubator, and I can't wait to hear what else you've learned and discovered. So thanks again, Alanna. This has been
Yeah.
awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor
Yeah,
to speak with you guys about it and share my passions and love and hear from you guys too.
yeah, right on. Just keep doing it. Keep going. Awesome. Okay, we'll chat soon.
Yeah. Talk
Okay,
soon. Thank you.
bye.